Okay, in this lecture, I'm going to cover section 9.2, photosynthesis and overview, and it's quite lengthy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about pigments and how they play a role in photosynthesis, talk about something called electron carrier molecules. That's probably going to be a new concept for you. And then finally, what are the reactants and products of photosynthesis? So those are just some of the objectives that we'll cover. But let's start off with lights, because photosynthesis means light putting together. And so white light is actually made of a mixture of different wavelengths, okay? The visible spectrum, Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And red wavelengths are larger in size than violet wavelengths. So a violet light has a smaller wavelength versus red light, which has a larger wavelength. So you may remember from Physical Science 9 the electromagnetic spectrum, and it was a series of radiation, okay, waves, different types of radiation arranged from big or large wavelengths to small. And starting off with the big wavelengths, we had like radio waves, and we went to infrared and microwaves. Well, I think it's microwaves and infrared. And red is infra, above the infrared waves. And then we have our visible light. And then beyond violet, we have ultraviolet, then X-ray rays, and then gamma rays. But white light, okay, the light that's in this classroom, the light that you see from the sun, is made up of a rainbow spectrum, okay? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violets. And so I usually show you a music video by They Might Be Giants, the Roy G. Biv, but I will spare you in this lecture video. Okay, so pigments are the light-absorbing compounds. They absorb light, and there are lots of different pigments found in a plant, but the big and probably the most important and the most common is chlorophyll. This is a pigment that absorbs sunlight. It's the main pigment in plants that do photosynthesis. There's actually different types of chlorophyll, like chlorophyll A. They tend to absorb light in the blue-violet light spectrum, and chlorophyll B absorb light in the red light spectrum. Chlorophyll reflects green light. So I'm going to go back a slide here, and you see this beautiful spectrum here. So we have chlorophyll A taking these colors, and chlorophyll B, and then our second type of pigment is called carotene. And they absorb the blue-green spectrum, and they reflect yellow, red, orange light. So we have these pigments that are very specific to wavelengths, but green primarily gets reflected back, and that is why plants are green. So I'm sure we've had this discussion before in a science class, like the colors that you see, that's the color that's being reflected, and that's what you perceive. So I'm like looking at the red shirt that I'm wearing, and all the lights, all the colors of the spectrum hit my shirt, but it's red. It's the red light that's reflected and hits my eyeball, and that's how I perceive my shirt to be red. Okay, so plants are green because all the colors of the spectrum, hit the plant, and it's the green light that gets reflected back to your eyeball, and you perceive that plant to be green. So a graph or a diagram showing chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and the carotenoids and the wavelengths that they tend to absorb, and you can see that it drops off in that green color area, and then picks up with the reds and the orange. So where are we going to be focusing in on this chapter? Specifically the chloroplast. So remember that, plant cells have chloroplasts. They also have a cell wall and a central vacuole located here, but we're really going to focus in on the organelle, the chloroplast, and this is where photosynthesis takes place. So the chloroplast are organelles that are found in plants, and this is where photosynthesis occurs. Its structure it's got a lot of bits and pieces to it. It has an outer membrane, an inner membrane, so it's double membraned. And then we have these thylakoids, which are the coin-shaped discs that are stacked on top of each other, and this is where you find the chlorophyll. When you get stacks of thylakoids, we call that a grana, and then outside of the thylakoids and the grana, but still inside the chloroplast, we have the stroma. So it's the fluid portion that fills the chloroplast. So I'm going to go back, outer, inner. Each one of these is a thylakoid. You stack them together, you get grana, and then everything outside the thylakoid, but still within the chloroplast, is called the stroma. So review, right? So a stack of thylakoids is the grana. This is the thylakoid membrane. I think I got this. Granum. Each one of these individual discs is a thylakoid. And then out here we have the stroma. Okay. So when chlorophyll absorbs sunlight, what it does is it transfers it to a specific spot, and they kind of call it a chlorophyll molecule. So think of a chloroplast. Okay, like on the chloroplast, you basically have this antenna, and these pigments are in the chloroplast, right? The chlorophyll, the keratin. And when sunlight hits them, they bounce it around and they're going to funnel it to a central location. And at the central location are these electrons. These electrons are going to get excited, and then they're going to get passed on to electron carriers and a few other protein molecules. But it's actually the energy from these electrons that are going to be used to build sugar from carbon dioxide and water. So it's going to transfer the sunlight, okay, energy from the sunlight to its own electrons. So electron carriers are needed because these electrons that pick up the energy from the sun, they have a lot of energy to them. They're highly reactive. So the definition of an electron carrier is a compound that can accept a pair of high energy electrons, transfer them along with most of the energy to another molecule. And so the energy carrier that we're going to focus in on photosynthesis is called NADP+. NADP+, in case you're wondering, stands for nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate. And so when it's just NADP+, it's empty. It's not carrying any electrons. It can actually hold 2 electrons, and when it picks up 2 high energy electrons as well as a proton, it becomes NADPH. And now it has electrons. It's carrying those electrons to another location. So you wouldn't carry hot coals in your hand, would you? No, you'd use a pan. So the pan would be your coal carrier. Why you heat up coals in the first place, I'm not exactly sure. But to make the analogy to NADP+, here's NADP+. It picks up 2 electrons and a proton, and it becomes NADPH. It carries it to a specific location. You drop off the electrons, and NADP+ can now go pick up some more electrons and bring it to a location. So an overview of photosynthesis, focusing in on the word equation here. Basically, you're taking CO2 and water. Those are the reactants, things that go into something, as well as some sunlight. This takes place in the chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is absorbed in that sunlight, and you are going to make 2 products, sugar, aka glucose, and oxygen. Here's the chemical equation. 6 molecules of carbon dioxide plus 6 molecules of water and sunlight and inside of chlorophyll. So those are my reactants. And you're going to produce C6H12O6, that's my sugar, as well as 6 molecules of water. And I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture that photosynthesis means light, and synthesis means putting together. So with sunlight, we are putting together something, in this case, sugar. So photosynthesis can be broken down into a light part and a putting together part, right? The photo and the synthesis. And so on this side, we have our photo part, reactions that are light dependent. How do we absorb that sunlight? How do we transfer that energy to make something? And so over here we have the light independent reactions, and this is going to be the sugar making part. Now, obviously you don't see that in this diagram. They're focusing in on NADPH, which is carrying electrons, and we'll talk a little bit about ATP, but it's going to drop energy and those electrons and protons off and go back to the light dependent reactions to pick up some more things. So 2 stages make up photosynthesis. Light-dependent reactions that take place in the thylakoid. The reactants, what you start with, are water, light, NADP+, and ADP. The products are going to be oxygen, O2, NADPH, and ATP. And so the steps for the light-dependent reaction, and this is obviously very vague steps because we're going to dive into this in depth next week or in a different lecture. Water splits from sunlight. It donates electrons to chlorophyll. Pigments use energy from the sun to add a phosphate to ADP. So you add phosphate plus ADP, it turns into ATP. Electrons from water transfer to NADPH, or P plus, to become NADPH. And then after that water splits, oxygen is going to be produced. So in the light-dependent reactions, oxygen is one of our big products. And then these two molecules are going to go on to the light-independent reactions. So what are some missing reactants when we take a look at this? Well, I talked a little bit about water splitting, right? Do I have that in here? I don't know if oh, here we go. On this side. Water. Talked about water, okay? Did I talk about anything else? Nope, just water. So we're missing water because water splits and it's going to donate those electrons. And what is being produced? Oxygen. Okay, light-independent reactions. We're going to take in CO2 and make sugars. This takes place in the stroma of the chloroplast. And what we're going to start off with is ATP and NADPH, and these were made from the light-dependent reactions, and then CO2 from the atmosphere. And what we're going to make is ADP and NADP+. These two will go back to the light-dependent reactions, and then we're going to make some sugars. So CO2 is absorbed, NADPH and ATP are used to make sugars. Now that seems really super simplified, but it's way more complex than that. Obviously, this is an overview of photosynthesis, things that we are going to cover in this chapter. So we are missing a reactant. What is it? CO2. What other product is produced? Sugars and other carbs. Okay, so let's focus in on these things right here. Okay, I think I got some questions. What compounds are recycled between these two stages? Geez. NADPH to NADP+, and ATP to ADP. What happens, this is a critical thinking question, what happens if an inhibitor of the light-independent reaction is added to the chloroplast? So if I add something to the light-independent reaction that stops this wheel, okay, boom, I'm going to put an X here, roadblock. What do you think is going to happen? Well, eventually the light-dependent reactions are going to shut down. Why? Because NADPH and ATP are not being made, or not being used, right? And they're not being converted into their lower energy forms, ADP and NADP+. So we don't get any more of these. So eventually the light-dependent reaction is going to shut down. Okay, we shut down the synthesis part and then give it enough time, light-dependent reactions will shut down. Okay. So that was 9.2. I covered a lot. There is an assignment, but this is an overview, and we're going to break this down step by step and actually go in detail the overview of photosynthesis.